Joining us now, Sabrina Siddiqui, national politics reporter for The Wall Street Journal, and Kimberly Atkinstor, MS Now political analyst, columnist for the Boston Globe, and writer of the Supreme Court newsletter, The Gavel. Hey, ladies. Thanks for kicking off Saturday with us. Sabrina, implicit in Bill Cassidy's message, at least through, based on my interpretation, was basically him saying, look, we could get Todd Blanche or we could get someone like Matt Gaetz, and I'm going to go with Todd Blanche. What's the way that you read it?
I think that Bill Cassidy was essentially looking for a way to rationalize why he is voting to confirm Blanche, especially when he has nothing to lose. He already lost his primary in part because President Trump wanted to punish him for voting to impeach him after January 6th. And, I want to take a step back with Cassidy because, he voted for RFK Jr. to be Health and Human Services Secretary. He was the deciding vote. And it was because he said he had gotten assurances from Kennedy that he would not tamper with vaccine policy. And then he later came to regret that vote. They have since clashed numerous times over RFK Jr. doing precisely that. So,
and though he was on disagreements, that was far more personal to him.
And it was far more personal to him as a doctor. But, what assurances does he actually have from Blanche? He's given these assurances in writing about the anti-weaponization fund and, the immunity deal with respect to the president and his sons and the IRS. But what stops him from reviving that anti-weaponization fund tomorrow if President Trump asks him to do so? And that's a question that he really could not address in those remarks.
Absolutely nothing stops Blanche and the president from redoing that. I'm not a lawyer, but I hear the one at the table is shaking her head. Yes.
That is correct.
I want to play some more sound from Bill Cassidy when he was talking about what he was concerned about at the DOJ, as he was saying he was going to vote for the guy who's going to head up the DOJ.
I'm particularly concerned about episodes of apparent lawfare. DOJ bringing suits against political enemies. I am realistic that President Trump can be unrelenting on this, but this will be true no matter who the Attorney General is. When former Attorney General Bill Barr endorsed Mr. Blanche, he said Mr. Blanche will run the department as effectively as anyone can under President Trump. Some have called that faint praise. I don't think that it is. I think it is a reality.
David, please let no one who has to say yes to me having a job give that sad little endorsement that he has been given to Todd Blanche. When you see and hear someone saying he won't be good at this job, I think, but he will be better than this other person who doesn't actually exist, when what senators are supposed to be doing is voting on what is before them.
That's right.
And using their morals, their scruples, their own beliefs, their understanding of how this person is going to operate and how the department and the agency is going to operate in order to say yes or no to this person. The idea that he is particularly concerned about episodes of apparent lawfare, does he think that they're going to stop with Todd Blanche at the top of at the DOJ?
That's basically his argument. It's like, no matter what, President Trump is going to want to continue to use this agency as a weapon against his perceived political enemies. So whether it's Blanche, whether it's somebody else, why not, why not? That is not the job. Imagine going out. Imagine that being your ending legacy in the Senate, is that you greenlit someone who, as you said, Eugene, you're supposed to be evaluating his record. Todd Blanche, who absolutely mangled the handling of the Epstein files, who okayed this weaponization fund enthusiastically until that was going to cost him his job. And then he said, oh, yes, here's a note. I promise not to do that. When he is not a party to the settlement that weaponization fund comes out of. So he doesn't have the power to stop it. He is someone who has gone after President Trump's political enemies with glee. You're looking at his probably the worst, least qualified attorney general candidate. Remember back in the day when Zoe Baird couldn't get confirmed because she didn't pay Social Security taxes on her nanny?
Yes.
Look at how far we've come. We have somebody who is an agent of authoritarianism who just got the okay from a senator who, as you said, had nothing to lose.
I would say how far we've fallen.
Yeah.
But, Senator Cassidy isn't the only one giving cover to now Attorney General Todd Blanche in the run-up to this. Let's look at what Senator Thom Tillis, another target of President Trump's, what he said to Jonathan Lemire on Morning Joe on Thursday about another rationale for why Todd Blanche should be confirmed.
You have praised his judgment, but how can you square that with his willingness to go along with these measures in the first place? If he had that judgment in the first place and changed his mind perhaps under duress, why do you think he's fit for Attorney General?
Because I believe that there are a number of things that Todd have done that were wise in protecting the president. Look, the big problem I have with this administration are people who are not protecting the president and not giving him unvarnished advice.
Sabrina, I mean, with that answer, we have now officially moved from the Department of Justice being an independent agency, even though it's under the umbrella of the executive. There is supposed to be independence between the Attorney General and the executive, the Attorney General and the President of the United States. And from everything we've seen, that independence has been whittled away. And in that response from Senator Tillis, it is now an afterthought. There is no more independence. The job of the Attorney General is to protect the president.
I mean, it's sort of just demonstrating how the president's approach to government, where you don't work for the government, you work for him, has really been somewhat normalized among Republicans, certainly. And one of the other things that I thought was really striking in comments that Senator Tillis made, because he was part of the deal, right? It was him and Senator Cornyn, in order to advance the nomination out of committee, who came up with this deal with Blanche around like scaling back or paring back the IRS immunity and, killing the anti-weaponization fund, even though days later Trump talked about reviving it. He also said, Tillis, that, if it ends up coming to pass that Todd Blanche goes back on his word that President Trump does revive this anti-weaponization fund, then the president will be answerable to the American people. But it was sort of another telling moment where it's like, well, typically senators, U.S. lawmakers who are elected by their constituents, by voters, are also answerable to the American people.
They're like, oh, someone should really do something about this.
You know what? I'm glad you said that, Sabrina, because it reminds me that rationale is the same rationale Mitch McConnell used after January 6th to not vote to convict Donald Trump in his impeachment. He's like, this isn't for us. He will be held accountable by not us, by the courts.
As if Congress does not have that oversight authority that is such a core function of what they are sent to Washington to do.
I still just really want to know what Bill Cassidy was thinking, and if there were these backroom conversations for him to actually provide cover, if this was an act of generosity or an act of self-preservation. But I think let's move on to the Epstein of it all. I mean, I'm being generous by describing it as generosity, but in terms of giving Murkowski and Collins the ability to say no, since they're in,
And they have been known to cut these deals in order to protect their colleagues. He's on his way out.
Because he did look pained when he was reading his statement. He did not believe it. He did not look like
I'm exhausted of
what he was saying.
When you said self-preservation, that's why I was like, that part, because part of me wonders, we hear with our ears in Washington that the threats that are leveled at these members by the president on social media is the tip of the iceberg. I wonder what kind of threats Senator Cassidy could have been getting from other entities. Like, if you don't do this.
And you know what that's called? That's called corruption. If he is not able to vote the way his conscience and the oath that he took directs him to vote because of some other threat, that is corruption. That is anti-democratic. And I think it's important to put a pin in that. That is not just how Washington works.
Correct.
That is not just how Washington is supposed to work. That means that the system is fundamentally broken in a way that takes the power from the people of the American people and puts it in the hands of these dark influences behind members of Congress. And that is absolutely unacceptable.
That's a very good point. Because I don't think we don't really traditionally view the way that Trump leverages his power in that kind of way by targeting members in some ways that lead to death threats. And exactly, as a form of corruption.
Yes.
But in terms of the Epstein of it all, let's listen to Amanda Roberts and Jess Michaels quickly, who responded to Blanche getting the votes for confirmation.
It's a very chilling message that they are sending across the country and to the survivors that are in their very district. It's telling them that at the end of the day, that they will not vote for them, they will not fight for them, and they will not hear them.
If you're saying you're going to vote on this man to be the Attorney General of the United States, there's no good reason to not take a peek at the files, given we've sent you files directly to your office. If senators vote yes, it means they do not care. They are refusing to look.
Sabrina, I'm curious just what you're hearing from voters and whether or not the Epstein issue is still high up on their priority list or in their consciousness, because yesterday it was not mentioned, at least as often as I thought it would be, by any of the lawmakers who ultimately voted for Todd Blanche. And even, I believe, with Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski also did not make much mention of the Epstein issue either.
You know, I think that it's an issue that it may not rank as a top priority for voters when they're casting their ballots, right? We talk about the economy, cost of living, which I know we'll get to after the break, but it is something that is still feeding into this idea, at least among Democrats and even some other voters, about corruption and how the Trump administration has handled the files, about influence as well, and protecting the elite who have been implicated in the Epstein files. And it's something that I think also has frustrated Republicans too, right? I mean, that is one of the issues among Republicans where the president actually gets his lowest mark. So it's something that could potentially still suppress turnout when it comes to people that Republicans need to show up at the polls, just because of the frustration around the lack of transparency from the Trump administration regarding the investigation.
It's also wrong.
It's literally illegal.
Yeah.
Like, there is a law in place that he has to release these files, and he hasn't. When I was in law school, that was called breaking the law.